Welcome to the Working with Subject Matter Experts podcast. If you're responsible for keeping your business profitable into the future, you need to be a learning organization. Here at the Working with Subject Matter Experts podcast, we talk about managing organizational knowledge to keep your business strong. I am your co-host, Nathan Eckel, and we are here with the host of the Working with Subject Matter Experts podcast, Peggy Salvatore. Peggy, how are you?
I'm fine today, Nathan. How are you?
We're doing good.
We're hanging in there, aren't we?
We're hanging in there. We're moving forward on this podcast because today we're going to circle back to something that you mentioned a couple episodes ago. We're going to talk about putting the 70-20-10 principle to work. And in case you didn't encounter that podcast yet, I'm going to summarize the principle for you, and then we'll go right over to Peggy. But the 70-20-10 principle is basically saying that 70% of your training really needs to be hands-on and 20% needs to be maybe less hands-on but more than cerebral only, maybe role-playing or something like that. And then 10% is the kind that you read and ingest and memorize and do all of that. The 10% of training that should only be 10% is probably more like 80 or 90%, and that's really why we have this big headache called shelfware, which we have done more than enough beating on in prior episodes. But Peggy, over to you. I mean, what can we do to have more effective coaching and mentoring programs for the 20%, or to go into more immersive learning for that 70%?
Yeah, well, I think, we're talking about putting the 70-20-10 principle to work for your organization in a way that you can really leverage and maximize your investment in training. And they say, whoever they are, that 70% of knowledge transfer occurs with just on-the-job training. That's the hands-on stuff we were talking about. 20% occurs in mentoring, coaching, and feedback interactions. And 10% is the formal stuff, the e-learning, the virtual learning, the sit in the classroom all day with your bun in the seat. So we're spending most of our money on what might be the least effective piece of this, which is what you're saying. So really, I think one of the things we want to concentrate on today is, we say 70% is OJT, it's on-the-job training. But it's that 20% that occurs in mentoring, coaching that I think maybe we'll spend a little bit of time today. Because a good mentoring program is really valuable, but they're tough to implement. Have you ever been involved in a mentoring situation, Nathan?
Absolutely. I have several mentors, but the actual program that I'm a beneficiary of took years and years to implement, and it took a lot of years of relational equity and whatnot. So it really seems like that piece of the puzzle really moves, to quote from Stephen Covey's son, at the speed of trust. It has a lot to do with relational equity, and it would seem to me like the caliber of the benefit would come right out of the caliber of the relationship.
Wow, I love the way you answered that. That's kind of why I asked you, because I know that's really your wheelhouse. You're really great with the soft skills and understanding that. And that's really where you're right. That's where most learning occurs. When you have that trust, when you have that relationship, it makes it easier to learn. And that's kind of part of what's challenging about the mentoring and coaching piece. Some of the other things that make it difficult is that when you have someone who's a valuable employee, so valuable that you would love for them to mentor other employees, sometimes they're so busy doing what they do that it's really hard to get them to carve out any time on a regular basis to mentor another employee. It's a matter of it being part of the culture so that you can prioritize that it's important for your employees. I think one of the most difficult situations I've ever seen with an implementation of a mentoring program was doing it with salespeople. Many salespeople who are paid based on their revenue generation. You don't want to pull them out of the field or off the street or away from customers, because all that time away from customers mentoring is time that they're not generating revenue. So you have to make sure that you have some way to incentivize them to mentor to begin with. So anytime you have someone where their production is related to where their productivity is related to their income, you somehow have to make sure you offset that in a mentoring situation. So that's kind of one little glitch I've seen in the mentoring situation.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting, Peggy, because it seems to me like what we're starting to talk about here. It seems easy to just talk about the problems on the surface, but to really dig up it's kind of like my best friend when I was growing up. He had some kind of problem. His parents did, because we were growing up. His parents had in their house I think tree roots like going into the sewer system or in the pipe. And before I knew it, the next time I went to visit him, I drove on my big wheel or my BMX bike, and I pedaled over there, and it was like a war zone in his front yard, because there were these heavy, front end loader and construction equipment right there, and they had basically had to dig up his entire front yard to get these roots out of the pipes and to repair it. And I think the township charged my friend's father, and there was an insurance issue. And I mean, I'm belaboring this, and I'm really exaggerating and prolonging this and making it a little painful to listen to, because it's probably if for the person that's listening to this right now, say, how in the heck can I get my top performing salespeople to take time on the job and be a nice Mr. Rogers neighbor to all the other people? I mean, I think you and I know if it's not hardwired into the culture, it's probably not going to happen. And so what needs to happen is the equivalent of thinking about how extensive the repair job is going to need to be in your culture. And it's not a matter, don't get me wrong, it's not a matter of you biting the bullet and firing off a few emails and dictating a few things. No, it's going to have to start with you, Mr. or Ms. CEO, COO, and anything with O in your title. It's going to have to start with you and your board of directors, and it's probably going to take 6 months or 9 months of talking and shared values and all. I mean, this is an extensive operation. Why am I exaggerating this so much? Because I'm not exaggerating it, because if this is really going to happen, if your organization is going to be a generous, top-level organization, it's not going to get that way without you being a learning organization, and reciprocity and trust, and the whole DNA of your place is going to have to be up-leveled so that you can compete with the other top culture organizations, so that when you decide to share information, help one another out, mentor, coach, lead, it's going to come from a place where you're leading by example. End of rant. Peggy, what are your thoughts?
Well, no, it's a perfect circle, because you started out talking about relational equity, and it really is. It's about leading by example, and so I think your rant was a nice little full circle there, Nathan.
Well, I'm gonna do even better. I'm going to bring the third most watched TED Talk of all time, Simon Sinek's "Start with Why," or I believe it's called something about great leaders, how great leaders get stuff done, or something like that. But the key phrase is "Start with Why." I had brought a simulcast in here in Delaware for some business leaders, and he was part of that simulcast, and he gave a great speech about the millennials. Those millennials out there, those fill in the blank millennials, and we have so many judgments about the millennials. And it was really brilliant what Simon did, because he started out, talking about all the snowflakey, stereotypical things about the millennials, and it sounded like he was switching sides and starting to kind of come down on those millennials again. And of course he wasn't. Of course, he set it all up brilliantly to come back to the rest of us, the boomers, the World War II generation, people like myself who are right in the middle of Generation X. And he basically said, when you've been doing a layoff culture for 20 or 30 years in the 80s and 90s, and then a new generation comes along. Why do you think that their ambition is going to be to climb a ladder when it seems like the ladder is completely burned off? Those were his words, but that was basically the sentiment. And then he went and he demonstrated what we can do instead, which is to use empathy. And we can confront the same lack of production issues or showing up at work late issues or whatever. And it's just the difference between the traditional, hey, you're late. Hey, this is the 5th time you're late or whatever, versus saying, hey, what's wrong? You've been late twice this week. What's going on? This isn't like you. Is everything okay? And one way, it's like George Jetson over at Spacely Sprockets getting yelled or fired, or Fred Flintstone at the Bedrock quarry, versus actually caring about other people. And, Peggy, you and I get it. I mean, not every business, not every industry has a ton of margin to be able to have a utopia here. But even if you're in a commodity industry, even if you have a pretty razor-thin margin, there's still a lot you can do, if only in your own personal growth and professional growth and the handful of your leaders, to try to make a difference. And it really does start there if you want your future and the future of your company to be something more than just scraping and scrapping and king of the mountain model. Peggy, over to you.
Nathan, that was a brilliant rant because, the topic is mentoring and coaching and the value of that. So what we're saying here is the mentees, the millennials, then why should I bother to put all this effort and time and learn this when I get the ladder kicked out from under me and I'm not going to have a job anyway? I think part of what may eventually shift in our business corporate culture is that we may come back to realizing the value of the lifetime employees. We may really this may be a very rude awakening, the fact that we're losing generational knowledge, and there's really no way to keep these people. I mean, people will retire, people will move on. So I think that when we see the effect of that and ongoing and business continuity practices, I suspect it may be a real cultural wake-up for us. And we could start to see, and again, I'm going to Pollyanna dream into the future, but that could be a pivot point for us in terms of how we look at employees.
Yeah, well, time will tell. Time will tell, but
humans aren't as disposable as we have come to believe they are in this Western culture.
For sure. So, time will tell. Speaking of time, we're out of it. So this has been yes, for a segue. This is the Working with Subject Matter Experts podcast. We've been talking about putting the 70-20-10 principle to work, and we really kind of segued and hijacked that to talk about the 20%, which is coaching and mentoring, and then we basically talked about corporate culture and empathy and valuing people. So this was a little bit of a surprise episode, but if you join us for the next one, we're going to talk about having trainers at the table. We're going to talk about the stakeholders and the governors and the governance of your organization and why trainers really need to be in there, but what trainers also need to do to be able to position themselves for being legitimately at that table. Can't wait to be there, but we're going to shut down right now. This has been the Working with Subject Matter Experts podcast. We'll see you on the next one.